Hi everyone, Stepan here. In today's video I'm going to continue the series on the London system, and today we are going to have a look at black setups which resemble the Grunfeld or Grunfeld setups which black would play against the London system. And the Grunfeld setup is a combination of a kingside fianchetto and the pawn on d5, and those of you who play the Grunfeld and those of you who play main lines of d4 openings, so the Queen's Gambit with d4 c4, know that the Grunfeld is a very sharp opening in which black 6 counterplay with his pieces sort of gives up the center to white, but then breaks it open with c5 and tries to make the game as sharp as possible, as early as possible. When white plays the London system against the Grunfeld, meaning that white doesn't play with the pawn on c4, but instead goes for a pawn triangle with the bishop outside on f4, the Grunfeld is not as sharp because, of course, the center is supported by c3, and black doesn't really have that much counterplay with his dark squared bishop. But also, black's setup is much more solid than when he plays the King's Indian setup, when he plays the Queen's Indian setup, when he plays normal d4, d5 or symmetrical setups. So if you haven't seen the previous videos in the series on the London system, please do. They are all very connected to each other, and unlike some other series, you really should study all approaches black would go for if you're a London system player. And if you play against the London system, then it's good to have several different options. In my opinion, and the way theory stands today, the Grunfeld is a great way to fight the London system, but it's very different to playing the Grunfeld main lines. In Grunfeld main lines, you play for sharp dynamic positions in which you try to checkmate your opponent and just win. But when you play it against the London system, you play it to neutralize white's chances and you play it to equalize easily. And I'm going to show you what both sides should be going for. But in my opinion, as I play this with, or as I play against the London system more often than I play the London system, I like this for black. And if you're trying to find a weapon against the London, the Grunfeld setup is great. Okay. So this is the position we are talking about. We're going to have a look at many different variations and move orders, and there are plenty move orders with which you could reach this position. But the main position is pawns on d4, e3 for white with the bishop on f4, and for black there's a pawn on d5, the g6 fianchetto on the king side. And that's basically the London system against the Grunfeld. Okay, now what are the common themes in this position? Well, firstly, white center is very well supported, and the e3 pawn is defending c4. White could choose to defend the d4 pawn with c3 as well, which means that black's normal pawn breaks c5 and e5 don't just make the center collapse, because there is some more support. That being said, white doesn't have to play for c3. White could also play c4 or knight c3, transposing either to the Jobava rapport London system or to the Berry attack. We're going to see that briefly a bit later on. But as I said, the center is very well supported. Furthermore, both sides, since they have moved their d-pawns, and it's unlikely that the f-pawns are going to be moving, have weaknesses on e4 and e5. Most often because white is the one with the move advantage, and white will usually be developing more quickly, he will be able to use the e5 square for his knight, and this is a very common setup, which you could see against symmetrical London system with d4, d5, and against Queen's Indian setups for black, where black has b6 and d5 played. In which case e5 is a hole which white should be trying to use. Okay, another idea, since black has played, g6, is to try and play for a kingside attack with h4, h5. Now, it's not deadly. It doesn't always work, but that's something you should bear in mind. Whenever black has a pawn on g6, h4, h5 is a good attacking chance. Okay, for black should be playing for c5 and d5. In fact, he should be playing both moves, as we are going to see. So you basically want the center to collapse, and then you're equal. And this is why the Grunfeld setup is so hard to play for London system players. So a common way to achieve that is to simply play for c5, and then to prepare the move e5 with rook to e8 and knight to d7, and then play for e5. And after you achieve these moves, white's center is going to collapse. On the other hand, white has ways to stop that. So for example, if c5 here and c3, and if black isn't careful, let's say black plays the move rook to e8, you could continue with b4, and this is a great way for white to play the position. Of course, black could have played knight c6 instead of rook to e8, but you can, as white, always try to counter those chances. So it's an opening which doesn't have too many plans, doesn't have too many ideas. It's extremely simple to learn. It's very easy to play for both sides, but in my opinion, white should go for more ambitious setups against the Grunfeld, which means that playing the Grunfeld against the London system, once white has already committed to bishop f4, is a great idea, because you know that you're going to have an easy game. So let's see how to get into the opening. So d4, knight f6 for black. White could play 2 knight f3 or 2 bishop f4. The advantage of playing 2 knight f3, well, the advantage of playing 2 bishop f4 is that you are sort of avoiding the queen b6 lines in symmetrical London system positions. For that, you should watch the intro video. I've explained all of that in depth, but I believe it doesn't really matter too much. If you're facing a Grunfeld player, he's going to play that. He's going to play the Grunfeld anyway. So knight f3, g6 for black, bishop to f4, and bishop to g7. And here black could still play the King's Indian defense, or he could play the Grunfeld. So white should go for a very annoying move order, which makes black decide. Now, if you don't know what your opponent does against the London system, which is very likely online or against a player you don't know in a tournament, then the move e3 is the main line. What I would recommend, the move knight to d2, and this is probably the smartest option because it forces black to play a precise move. Now, black could either choose to stop e4 or he could allow e4. So if he plays castles or if he plays d6, playing for a King's Indian setup, then I would recommend the move e4, and after, let's say, castles, you play bishop to d3, and okay, you're not playing the London system anymore, but you have a broad center, and this is just a great position. Now, if you don't want to play this, which, of course, this is not the London system anymore, you can play the move e3. But playing knight b to d2 on move 4, I think, is a great idea, just preparing e4. Okay, to counter that, after knight b to d2, black should play the move d5, and now you play e3 and you are back into the normal London system. But if you remember the position we saw in the introduction of the video, this is now a Grunfeld setup and there's no turning back anymore. Okay, on move 4, white has several other options. White doesn't have to play e3 or knight b to d2. He could play c3, he could play h3. h3 is a move which people often play in the main lines. Let's look at that. e3 is the main move, by far the main move, and d5. Okay, of course, black could have played d6 or castles, several other options, but let's focus on d5. Okay, if black chooses to play something else, you have to simply know the other setups. So if castles, bishop e2, d6, h3, this position I've covered in the King's Indian setup against the Grunfeld, so look at that. Also, if 4 d6, h3 castles, bishop e2, c5, this has also been covered. So you have to know all of these different setups and just learn all of them. Also, c5 could be played on move 4, and b6, which is sort of a reversed English for black. So plenty of options for black. But if he plays for the Grunfeld, then white has a couple of options here. The main move is h3. Even though h3 is not really necessary, this move prepares to save the bishop, of course, in case of knight h5. But if you play, for example, bishop e2 instead of h3, after knight h5 you don't actually lose your bishop for nothing. So, for example, bishop to h5 and f6 and bishop to g3 and knight takes and pawn takes. And this is quite a weakness. So not playing h3 saves the tempo. First of all, you've developed your bishop. You've made black's pawn structure worse. Fine, e5 is going to happen because f6 has been played, but where's this king going? And I really don't think there are any issues for white here. But still, h3 on move 5 is the main line, and people like to save their bishops. Okay, but let's look at bishop to e2 first. We're going to look at knight b to d2 as well, and we're going to look at c4, c3, and knight to c3, which leads to the Barry attack. So let's look at all the options white has against the Grunfeld setup. Bishop to e2 is, in my opinion, the best move, and as we saw, knight h5 will lead to a position where black will have to play the move f6 to win the bishop, which I don't think is good. Okay, instead of that, black should simply castle, and now let's say castles, and black plays the move c5. We play the move c3, and black plays the move knight c6. And in this position, you have to be aware that whenever knight c6 is played, we do actually lose the bishop without provoking f6. Because if, let's say knight b to d2 is played and knight h5, if you play bishop e5, then black takes it with the knight. And if you play bishop g5, then this is a very common sequence of moves in the Grunfeld against the London system, to lose the bishop this way, but black has had to weaken himself slightly. But still, after bishop to e2, if this is the position you get, and it's extremely likely that this is going to happen because c5 and c3 and knight c6 and knight bd2 are just very natural moves, I find this position very pleasant for white, because these pawns are weak. Your center is perfectly solid. You got rid of your worst bishop because your pawns are on dark squares, and I think this is just fairly pleasant. Okay, instead of that, if you don't play bishop to e2, let's look at some more options. You can play knight b to d2, but this is likely going to transpose to the line we saw previously with either h3 or bishop e2. You could also play bishop d3, and I would like to talk about this move. Usually when you play the London system, they teach you that bishop d3 is the move. In King's Indian and Grunfeld setups, with the pawn on g6, the bishop is just better on e2. Okay, it's controlling the e4 square, but you're not really going to give up your bishop for the knight, and also it's biting on granite on g6. So bishop d3 on move 5, or in fact on any move, I don't think is a good idea. Sometimes the engine is going to find justification for playing bishop d3, but it's very likely that us mortals are not going to understand that. So just put your bishop on e2. There are two reasons for that. First reason, it's not attacking the g6 pawn. Second reason, if you ever decide to attack with h4, h5, it's actually supporting the pawn. Okay, so that's bishop to d3. I would recommend that you don't play it. c4 on move 5 is an option, so you're playing into the main line 3 knights Grunfeld, and here, if you are a London system player who also knows the main line of d4, c4 openings, then good for you. I don't think there are many people who can do that, so I'll just show you the transposition. So if you play c4, then castles, knight c3 and c5, and this is now the Hungarian variation of the 3 knights Grunfeld. Watch the series on the Grunfeld Defense if you don't know this. I covered it in detail there. So dc5, queen a5, this is all just mainline stuff which Grunfeld players know. dc4, bishop c4, but as I said, obviously not the London system anymore. So if you want to play the move c4, be prepared for main Grunfeld lines. Then another option is c3, which is just passive. I think developing your bishop or your knight first is just better. You don't want to play c3 until they play c5. There's just no need to do that. You have your e3 pawn. But often this is going to transpose as well. So let's say castles, and let's say knight b to d2 and b6. And the b6 is something you have to be aware of. This is similar to the Queen's Indian setup Black would play against the Grunfeld, but the bishop is not on e7, it's on g7. And b6, bishop b7 is a good idea, because after e5 happens, and this pawn advances to d4, sometimes this bishop is going to become a really great piece. So for example, bishop e2, bishop to b7, let's say h3, let's say c5 and castles. And this is basically the queenside in black's position is what you get in the Queen's Indian defense in almost every game. The difference is that if it was a normal Queen's Indian, black would have a pawn on e6, a bishop on e7, and this pawn would be back on g7, and then you'd have a normal Queen's Indian. So playing c3 I think is passive, and I think black should go for a Queen's Indian setup. Another move is knight to c3, which is the Barry attack. Probably better known as the Jobava London system, but this move order was known as the Barry attack in the 80s, 70s, 80s, 90s. Okay, so against knight c3, black should castle. I wouldn't advise you to play knight c3. I don't think it's a good setup, but suit yourself. Bishop to e2, c5, and it's much easier to break the center when you don't have the option to support it with c3. And fine, you may know a lot of theory here. This has been played by Polgar and I mean a million players back in the old days. You may know a lot of theory, but it's going to be harder to play than the main lines. Knight c6, castles, c takes d4, e takes d4, queen b6. This has all been played a lot before. So Judith Polgar, but Evgeny Barev played it with white. Pavel Alyanov played it with white. Mark Hebden used to play it a lot. You can see the game Mark Hebden versus John Nunn, where Mark Hebden won. So it's a good attacking setup, but it isn't really a normal London system. And the last move I would like to mention is pawn to h4, which, as I said, whenever black has a fianchetto setup, h4, h5 is an idea. Here, it's just not good enough. Black can just ignore it and castle. You're not playing h5, you're not giving up an exchange for nothing. So bishop e2 to prepare that, but now c5, and you have to defend, and then bishop g4. And whenever black can play bishop g4, h4 is sort of a wasted move, and you're never getting rid of the spin because you don't have h3. So I'd forget about h4. Okay. So yeah, let's focus on the move bishop to e2 for the moment. As I said, this is I think the best option after castles, c5, c3, knight bd2. Black of course doesn't have to go for knight h5 if he doesn't want to. He could play knight d7 or queen b6 or cd4. It's important to note that after queen b6, queen b3 is a good move. Another sort of I want to trade off pieces thing that white could go for. But as I said, against the Grunfeld it's very hard to play for a win, so that's okay. Okay, now the main lines, h3 and castles by black. Of course, knight h5 now makes no sense. Bishop e2. Now we have the same position just with h3 interposed. c5, c3. Here, as I said, black should play knight c6, because if he doesn't, white should strike straight away with b4. So whatever black plays in this or in these types of positions, which doesn't stop b4, you play b4 and just break open the position. I should just mention then that black should never take on d4, because after you take with the c pawn, you get the c3 square for your knight, and you have traded off the central pawn, so this would be beneficial for white. So knight c6 and white castles, and this is now basically a Catalan in reverse. I'm not sure how familiar you are with the Catalan, but when have you seen black play the London system against the Catalan? That's very strange, which goes on to show that black's position is just perfectly fine and makes a lot of sense, and that the London system has not been designed to be played against the Grunfeld, because it's just too solid. Black's position is just great. And now black goes for a very thematic maneuver, which I would like to highlight, and that's knight to d7. Defending this pawn is not too relevant. If this pawn ever captures on c5, well, actually, let's look at it here, then e5 becomes a much easier move. And if you look at this is sort of a d4 opening in reverse, where black is playing with the white pieces. So this move knight to d7 not only defends the pawn, which shouldn't be taken anyway, but prepares the move e5. And for example, knight b to d2, e5. And this is what black is going to play for. And if black plays the Grunfeld against the London system, this is going to happen in every game. And unfortunately for white, this position is equal. And unfortunately for white, there's no way to prevent it. Okay, knight takes e5. Let's say knight d takes e5. D takes e5, knight takes, and now we don't have to trade. You can play knight to f3, knight takes, bishop takes, for example, bishop e6. This has been played several times. Several strong players have played on from this position. And does it get more equal than this? White's pawn structure is slightly better, but after something like rook c8 and b6, there will be no issues in the black position either. If black manages to push d4, then you can just probably agree to a draw. Okay, now let's look at two example games. One game I would like to look at briefly. So we are starting in this thematic position and the black pieces were Alexei Drev, Gata Kamsky had white, Alexei Drev played c5, and we have c3, and b6 by Alexei Drev. I wanted to look at this position because Drev played this Queen's Indian Grunfeld hybrid. Knight bd2, knight c6, castles, bishop e7, a3, and a3 is designed to prepare b4. This is a pattern I wanted to show you. Even if the knight is on c6, playing b4 is going to weaken the future e5, and sometimes when this pawn has been traded off on black, or black has been forced to get hanging pawns, e5 is actually going to leave him with an IQP on d5, so that's not going to be good. Okay, black reacts with the thematic knight e4, rook c1, developing his last piece, or one before last, rook c8, and now b4, striking at the queen side. Knight d2 played, queen d2, and c4. And this is a concession by black. And this, I think, is the way for white to go for an advantage. Unlike my other videos in the London system series, this video against the Grunfeld, you're going to have to learn the positional stuff. And I think the only chance for an advantage is to provoke the move c4. And after c4 happens, white should switch his attention to playing f3, e4, or to playing f4, f5, if you want to go for an attack. And I think once c4 happens, it becomes easier to play. You should also continue with a4, b5 if you have the opportunity to grab more and more space. Now, what were black's options? Well, firstly, if black ever captures on d4, then you take with the c pawn. You have the semi-open, you have the open c file to work with. This knight doesn't really have a ton of good squares. If you push b5, this knight is going to be very useful coming into the c4 square, but you're not going to push b5. And if this knight ever moves, if this knight is ever traded off, for example, giving up this bishop for the knight, and bishop takes c6, and if you manage to play b5 then this bishop is going to be a bad piece. Another option was, of course, taking on b4. You again take with the c pawn, you get a similar position. So c4 is in fact the best option, but similar to what happens in d4, d5 openings when white pushes c5, then it becomes much easier for black to play e5. In this case, it becomes much easier for white to play e4. So e4 should be played. Okay, a4, queen d7, rook a1, supporting a5, a5 from black, and b5 from white. And white has a ton of space. White has a very pleasant position. White should go for an attack because the queen side is closed, because black's center is sort of tied down, because this bishop is bad, because this knight is on the queen side, because no pieces are included. That means that white should try and play on the king side. Okay, so I'll just briefly show you what happened. So rook a1, e6, knight to d2, knight d6, rook f1, and all the pieces are preparing for an attack. Queen e7, f3 chasing the knight away, knight g5, knight back to d2, e5, and now f4. And basically, if white manages to keep this bishop out of play, then he's going to be playing a piece up. So ed4 happened, ed4 happened, knight e4, and of course that's traded off, knight e4, d4, and now f5. Making making the black kingside and center are uncoordinated. So bishop to h6 you of course don't want to take. Bishop to g4, now supporting the pawn, rook c to d8. And of course in this position white already has a passed pawn, black already has a weakness on e4. So by closing down the queen side with c4, Drev gave Kamsky enough time to play on the king side, and Kamsky managed to create two big advantages. So queen e2, I'll just go through the moves quickly. And here white actually won a pawn and went on to win the game in about 5 moves. Now this was a blitz game, so I don't want to be too hard on Alexei Drev, but still it was an interesting game. Okay, the next game is Karlov, Tiger, Hillarp, Persson, and I would like to start in this position again. The difference is that Tiger Persson played the move bishop d3. Again, I think bishop e2 is a much better option. Okay, c3, and in this game I would like to focus on 2 patterns. knight to c6, knight b to d2 castles. And in this position, Tiger played the move h3, which was completely unnecessary when the bishop is on d3. So one thing you should note, when you have a bishop on d3, in this position or in a similar position, h3 is unnecessary because the same pattern of bishop g5, h6, bishop h4, g5 doesn't work because you have knight takes g5. This bishop provides an excellent mating setup. I'll show you how. So for example, if white plays a normal move like castles, which is better, and black plays knight h5, now you can play bishop g5 and your bishop is better than the knight. It's more of an improvement for your piece than it is for the knight to get from f6 to h5, and h6 g5 simply cannot be played. Here h6 bishop h4, and now if you play g5, black loses the game. You just take knight takes g5 and you either lose a pawn or you just lose on the spot. If you take the knight, then queen takes h5 and game over. So if you for example play f5, I'll just take here and yeah, it's over. So after castles, h3 was unnecessary. I think Tiger person was still young in '99, but I'm not sure. Okay, but he played h3, and now since white played h3, black was given a bit more time, and here's what happened. He went for e5 straight away with knight d7, and after white castle, he played e5. And of course you have to react, you cannot lose a piece, so d takes e5, your center is gone, you don't have a d pawn anymore. Knight d takes, again, that's always going to be correct for black, and in this position white didn't exchange, he played bishop to c2. And here black is already equal, perfectly equal. h6 played to stop knight g5, bishop g5, and to prepare g5. Now knight takes e5, knight takes e5, and e4. And basically white was the one who played the black pieces in this game. If you're familiar with the Slav, the semi-Slav, or similar openings where you have to break open the position with e5 because white has this strong center, this is exactly what white is doing here, and he is forced to play the black pieces. So whoa, okay, e4, d takes e4, knight takes e4, b6, and I'm not saying black is much better, black is just completely equal. There is no way white has an advantage. So that's what happens if you know the Grunfeld setup well. Knight d6 played, queen f6, bishop takes e5, excuse me, queen takes e5, rook e1, queen g5, and bishop e4 attacking the rook b8. And now bishop d5, and black went badly wrong because he let stuff hang on his f7 pawn. He played bishop takes h3, we had knight takes f7, rook takes f7, bishop f7 check, king h7, and queen d5 happened, and basically it was game over. I'm not sure what happens on queen takes f7, although I think you get mated. Ah, no, you just lose the bishop. Okay, and if he doesn't cover, let's say he covers with the bishop. Yeah, you just lose the bishop on h3. Excuse me. Okay. So even though black equalized, he managed to mess up later. But I just wanted to focus on this pattern of e5, and I think this game was a great example. Okay, sorry if the video was a bit longer. I hope you got something from this. It took me a while to understand this Grunfeld setup, and I actually played a few training games against myself to test this out. I hope you liked the video, hope you learned something. Let me know if I missed something, let me know if you have any questions, and tomorrow I'm going to finish the series with the Dutch setup against the London. Thank you very much for watching, and stay tuned for more chess. Bye bye.